3 p.m. on a Saturday afternoon. My plan was to make a cup of coffee and spend about an hour or so fighting a boss in Star Wars Jedi Survivor before going to hang out with some friends in the evening. 1 hour turned into 2 until I finally forced myself to head out around 3.5 hours later. I made it home for my plans around midnight with another rough gaming timeline. An hour, maybe an hour and a half. I was just starting to get the hang of the boss's patterns and I thought I should be able to beat him by then. I can distinctly remember watching the clock as it hit 1:37 a.m. and telling myself that I can get a couple more tries in before heading to bed around 2. I didn't end up going to bed until 4:30 in the morning. If you've played Jedi Survivor, you probably know exactly who I'm talking about, and that's General Ravis. So this boss has 2 phases. Phase 1 is relatively manageable. He has a few mace swing attacks, with the mace's head occasionally extending out like a whip. He has AoE rockets that cover most of the map with circles to indicate where they hit, a blaster, a few other moves. The Phase 2 is a completely different story. Ravis's mobility skyrockets, and he can easily string a dash into a flurry of mace attacks with almost 6 strikes, combining fast, slow, blockable and unblockable, low and high radius attacks, way more aggressive and much more unintuitive attack patterns. So dangerous that he killed me several times with 4 or more stims unused. And to top that all off, he even has health regen. This dude had me on the internet between attempts, just doom scrolling for different tips on how to beat the fight. A lot of people said to use the dual saber parry ability. Opinions varied on whether to keep your distance or whether or not to parry or dodge, but the most dreaded one, you just need to learn his attack patterns. I guess I wasn't just missing some skill or secret that would have made the fight easier. I just sucked and needed to play better. When I finally put him away the following morning, I couldn't stop thinking about how fun it was fighting Ravis for almost 10 hours over the course of the last day. And this had me thinking about when the last time was that I had this much fun fighting a boss from the mainline Souls series. I think it might have been Margit all the way back in the beginning of Elden Ring. And the question in my head was why? What did Jedi Survivor do that made boss fights, namely the Ravis fight, so much more engaging than Elden Ring has been in years? And after playing through the rest of Jedi Survivor, I think I have a pretty good answer. So this video is an exploration into what makes Jedi Survivor's bosses engage me in a way that Souls hadn't in a long time. So let's get started. A Souls game can't just be built up of these epic set-piece boss fights that push you to the limits of your abilities against 1 or 2 opponents. That would probably be too stressful for the player. And it would probably make you appreciate the boss fights even less. It's those interstitial sequences between these fights that are really important for pacing. Exploration, smaller fights such as mob enemies, mini-bosses, all of this stuff helps to give you a chance to level up and get a break between boss fights. This is an area where Jedi Survivor shines, and unfortunately, modern Souls/Elden Ring seems to struggle quite a bit. One of the biggest problems I had in Elden Ring was the disconnect between the moment-to-moment level design and the boss battles. How many times as playing an area in Elden Ring looked a little bit like this? First, you play through a castle or a dungeon as intended, working through the enemy placements sequentially and trying to fight to the next bonfire, essentially tackling the challenges of each area the way the developers most likely intended. Maybe do that 2 or 3 or 10 more times if you keep dying, but eventually you'll stop trying. At least that's what I always tended to do. After I did that enough times, I would inevitably give up trying to play the area fair and square, and then just beeline to the fog door into what is essentially just a different video game. Because what really is the point of fighting any mob enemy in pretty much the majority of Elden Ring? Most of the items and upgrades can be acquired by this mad dash strategy, especially if you know where to find all of the resources, such as weapons and armor in the world. The souls you get from these enemies really don't matter that much either anymore. The souls economy has pretty much been broken for a while now. I think if you play Elden Ring in the way I'm describing and pretty much run past everyone but the bosses, there would still be enough souls from boss experience and drops to stay properly leveled throughout the whole game. Most importantly, Elden Ring doesn't really stop you from playing like this. At least in older Souls titles, mobility options and map sizes are much more limited, especially in the original Dark Souls, so you're much more likely to get killed trying to rush past everyone. In Elden Ring, you can sprint and jump past almost everyone, besides a few exceptions. This can often leave the game's pacing to feel pretty badly tuned. Now let's contrast this with how the Star Wars Jedi games play. For the most part, these levels feel better paced with enemy encounters that are layered and challenging. Moment to moment, a level will usually involve some cinematic set piece, several parkour and movement puzzles, and well-sequenced enemy encounters. The best part about this is that there's rarely ever a reason to sequence break or skip past enemies. And there's a few reasons for that. One, the placement is often not conducive to it. Enemies will take blaster shots if you get too far away without killing them, and can quickly close the distance to stagger trigger you for other attacks, oftentimes leaving you dead before you can even turn around. There's also a lot of doors and other fixtures on the critical path that can't be interacted with before dealing with the enemies. Finally, you most likely wouldn't even want to. The game's focus points are directly tied to killing enemies and are extremely useful for upgrading Cal's abilities, and enemy encounters are often layered and have the most valuable enemies show up deep into a fight sequence, again preventing cheesing strats to quickly farm focus points. So there's really no easy way to collect focus levels without blatant exploits. Now, why does that matter so much? Because in short, it compels players to respect the tightly designed pacing in these games. The mob encounters in Jedi Survivor are laid out with a precise pace, forcing players to navigate these levels exactly how they're intended to be played, which ends up making for much more fun levels in my opinion. Souls games desperately need challenges that aren't just these heart-pounding boss encounters. Good levels test different skills a player can have, such as mobility and crowd control / enemy prioritization. And they also force you to build more versatile player characters that aren't just optimized perfectly to kill one boss. And if this is done right, by the time we arrive at the boss battle, most players are refreshed and ready for another gated one-on-one battle, or in other words, this channel probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for how much I've been inspired by the Souls boss fights. Some of the best gaming experiences someone can have come from slowly learning and iterating against these guys until you finally sneak out a win after maybe 30 or 40 attempts. The best Souls boss fights feel almost like they were designed scientifically. It feels almost like the game is intimately attuned to the player's power level, and the boss is just a little bit stronger than that. And how do you bridge that gap? Hours of paying attention, studying movesets, and learning when to attack, parry, or dodge, and also experimenting with any gear combinations that may give you just a little advantage. Over the course of the Souls series, I've noticed that not all of these games are created equal in their ability to compel me to put in these hours. In my opinion, there is one critical component of a Souls-like, a must-have feature to create these sticky boss fights that give players that just one more attempt kind of feeling. And that component can be summed up into one word: clarity. When attempting to defeat Ravis, I knew exactly what my parameters were. First of all, I was playing on the Jedi Grandmaster difficulty. What that meant was super tight parry windows, brutal damage, and what that means effectively is that I needed to learn the battles with that much greater precision. Both the general boss behavior as well as each specific attack combo and how those strung together needed to be studied in order to win, no brute forcing. Second, I had health and stim upgrades. I had 8 stims for this fight, and I knew I could get at least 1 or 2 more from exploring some of the other planets. There were maybe a few health upgrade points as well if I did some thorough exploration of the map. I could also unlock more health or force buffs via the skill tree. 5 lightsaber stances, each one with its strengths and weaknesses. I could upgrade some of the movesets in each of these 5 lightsaber paths as well via the skill tree. And that was it. Those were my options. And maybe some players may have found that limiting, but I found it super refreshing to know exactly what levers I could play with to make the fight easier for myself, and what part would just be me learning how to fight better. In short, there wasn't this constant voice in the back of my head saying, is this how I'm supposed to be playing this game? Or am I just missing something? Now let's contrast that with Elden Ring, a game where that voice was louder than ever before. Let's say you encounter a late game boss in Elden Ring. They hit like a truck, have hitboxes that are basically impossible to dodge. They're so tough that it almost feels unfair. You walk into that fog door to fight them after 57 failed attempts. What are the levers, and by that I mean ways to power up your character and not yourself, that you could pull here to try to move this fight in your favor? You could level up, increase health, stamina, or any other stats that would allow you to deal more damage with your weapons. Upgrade your weapons, choose a different weapon set, switch from int to faith, strength to dex, etc. Change your talismans, change your skills / ashes of war, find a new spell or sorcery, find a new weapon with more favorable strength or speed or moveset. Go explore the map some more. Maybe there's something that you were meant to see before you fought this boss. Upgrade your spirit ashes, maybe get a new spirit ash, upgrade Estus flasks or get more, summon a friend or 2 to help out, and the list goes on. With the level of complexity present, especially later in the game, it's almost impossible for the developers to account for who is entering the boss fight. And it's almost impossible for the player to know if their player character is up for a fair fight that pushes them to the best of their abilities. And this really took me out of the experience of fighting bosses in Elden Ring, because it was really hard to commit myself to those hours and hours of fighting these massive challenges when the developers may have intended that I walked into the fight with Black Knife Tish and maybe 3 more Estus flasks. I can remember so many fights that seemed just a little overtuned without help, just too hard to beat with the build I was using. But of course, the second I summoned my +10 Mimic tier, the fights became much too easy and I would usually beat them within 1 or 2 tries. And at this point you might be thinking, just don't use Mimic Tier if it makes things too easy, and use Mimic Tier or whatever else you want to help you win if things get too difficult. And to that, I would answer that the lack of clarity is really the problem here, not level of difficulty. I never wanted these fights to be easier or more difficult, except for maybe Millennia. I just wanted to know if I needed to get good, or if I was making some massive build mistake that was making things unreasonably hard for myself. And the contra to that, did FromSoft intend for me to be this powerful and design enemies that would pose a challenge against my current build? Without an attempt to answer this question, it felt like I was tasked with designing my own difficulty curve, which in my experience almost necessarily prevented me from just pinning my ears back and committing to learn how to tackle each boss. I think early game Elden Ring really hammers my point home. Found the Margit boss fight at Stormvale to be a ton of fun. It was super tightly balanced while providing a ton of challenge, even to veteran Souls players. And I think a lot of what made this fight great was simply by the nature of it being very early in the game, and thus reducing the amount of systemic complexity that eventually occurs. And because of that, I had a much better idea of what systems I could use to make things easier for me, and how much of the fight was just me getting better as a player. I found that if I put a good faith effort to balance learning Margit's moveset and weaknesses, and if I did what I could to make my character stronger, such as leveling up, upgrading my weapons, and using spirit summons, the challenge level ended up being perfect. In my opinion, Margit's perfect difficulty is very much predicated on how early game Elden Ring is able to put bounds on what tools and resources a player has. The area of Limgrave masterfully uses its geography to subtly guide players towards lighter challenges, such as Castle Morn, as well as a few Everjails. What the game is doing here, which is rarely done in the back half, is giving you that sense of clarity. There are only so many levels you can reasonably gain here, only so many flask upgrades, only so many smithing stones, only a few spirit summons that can only be leveled so much. The bounds placed on attainable resources are so much better defined here. And since the resources I could reasonably acquire didn't feel too game breaking, I felt comfortable using every advantage I could find without feeling like I was going to ruin the challenge for myself. And these clear bounds on how difficult the fight was supposed to be allowed me to struggle against Margit over and over again without feeling like I was wasting my time or missing something. And if the fight ever felt like it was too challenging, I could just go explore Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula to find more resources to make me stronger. I spent almost a full day either fighting Margit or exploring the area to get stronger for the fight. And when I finally beat him, I felt that rush of accomplishment unbridled by the gnawing feeling that I was somehow robbing myself of the intended experience. It does bother me that my first in-depth coverage of Elden Ring is this critical. Though I did think my criticisms are valid, I'd be remiss if I didn't at least briefly mention a few things that Elden Ring did well. First and foremost, they took a massive step towards just bringing the Dark Souls formula into an open world. My first playthrough of Elden Ring, when I didn't know anything about the game, had such a magical feel to it. That sense of discovery, learning just how expansive and layered this game was, might be a top 10 gaming experience for me, despite my aforementioned woes. It is, however, maybe an unfortunate inevitability that with this level of depth and complexity in Elden Ring, we lose the tightly designed level and game design that Souls is known for. And while Star Wars Jedi games do provide this tightly crafted level design that Elden Ring and Shadow of the Erdtree have been missing, it obviously does not come with the same epic sense of scale that Elden Ring provides. So maybe that really is the trade-off inherent to the Souls genre. Do we want carefully crafted, moment-to-moment level design with perfectly tuned boss fights, or an epic adventure with thousands of options for build crafting? I'm starting to think that we can't have both. Unless Miyazaki finally adds difficulty options, but I'll save that thought for another video.